Shalom vänner, profetisk uppdatering 6 december 2024. Och bakom mig ser ni en havsörn eller ett par havsörnar på Jätterön eller i Jätterön Varberg där Janne och jag var i onsdags och fotade i gömslet där. Det var 12 havsörnar i viken, inne i viken. Härliga fåglar som Gud har skapat, och det finns en naturfilm som jag har gjort därifrån. En kort film som ligger på hemsidan om ni vill se. Och i filmen som la ut några bibelversar som jag vill läsa. Ordspråksboken 23 vers 4. Slit inte ut dig för att bli rik, var klok nog att avstå från det. Far inte med blicken efter det som ingenting är. Ty det gör sig vingar och flyger som örnen mot himlen. Och Matteus 6:33 där Jesus säger: nej, sök först Guds rike och hans rättfärdighet, så ska ni få allt det andra också. Med andra ord, vi får det vi behöver och Gud hjälper och förser när vi gör det vi ska. Gör er alltså inte bekymmer för morgondagen, den ska själv bära sitt bekymmer. Var dag har nog av sin egen plåga. Bra att bli påmind om det där, för det är ju så lätt för oss människor att oroa oss och bekymra oss för morgondagen, för framtiden. Men Jesus uppmanar oss att inte bekymra oss, inte göra oss bekymmer, utan varje dag får vi lita på Gud och leva för honom. Ja, då går vi till lite nyheter här. All Israel News skriver: romersk bankettsal av Herodes Agrippa den andra upptäckt i Banjas grotta, norra Israel. Det är arkeologiska upptäckter och fynd som man ständigt gör i landet. Hednisk plats tillägnad den grekiska guden Pan omvandlades till en exklusiv bankettplats enligt beskrivningen av Josefus. Det är ju den historikern Josefus som skrev, som det finns mycket som bekräftar bibelordet, också det han berättar om på den tiden. Nya utgrävningar i Hermon Stream Nature Reserve, naturreservatet och Banjas, en arkeologisk plats på Golanhöjderna, har avslöjat nya bevis som kastar ljus över förvandlingen av en helig grotta till en bankettsal i romersk stil, byggd av Herodes den stores barnbarn. Banjas grottkomplex innehöll en stor central klippa som möjligen innehöll ett altare eller en staty och en akvedukt som kontrollerade vattennivån för att hålla denna klippa synlig hela tiden. Mynt som upptäckts i grottan har möjliggjort en mer exakt datering av renoveringsperioden till cirka 69 efter Kristus. Idag är Banjas, även kallat Hermon Stream Nature Reserve, känt för sina vattenfall, vandringsleder och antika ruiner. Däremot har sidan varit stängd för besökare i över ett år på grund av den pågående Israel-Hizbollah-konflikten i Libanon. Trots bränder orsakade av raketer har själva Banjasgrottan förblivit oskadad. Planerna på att återskapa den romerska matsalen i Banjas ligger på is i väntan på ytterligare bedömningar efter konflikten. Slutcitat. Jag tror att Janne har en inte lika rolig minnesbild av Banjas när vi var där för många år sedan, och jag skulle locka med Janne på den här vandringsleden. Problemet var att han hade inte lytt mitt råd att ta på sig ordentliga skor, så han gick i sån här flip-flop skor och hade ganska ont i fötter och vader efter denna långa promenad som vi gjorde. Ja, vad har vi mer då för nyheter? Vad har vi för nyheter i den sjuka världen, om vi säger så? För mycket i denna världen är väldigt sjukt. Australien registrerar 400% ökning av antisemitiska incidenter sedan massakern den 7 oktober, skriver All Israel News. Och det är väl inte det enda exemplet på ökad antisemitism och antisionism. Det är ju faktiskt ett bibliskt tidstecken och som vi varnas för. Vi ska inte ta del i sådant eller i sådana åsikter. Vi välsignar det Gud har välsignat och vi gör det Gud uppmanar oss till i sitt ord. Han har välsignat sitt utvalda folk, han har välsignat Israel och det gör vi också. Arutz Sheva, israeliska utrikesdepartementet kritiserar Amnesty International. Folkmordsmassakern utfördes av Hamas. Det israeliska utrikesdepartementet betonade vidare: israeliska medborgare har utsatts för dagliga attacker från 7 olika fronter. Israel försvarar sig mot dessa attacker och agerar helt i enlighet med internationell lag. Amnesty International har ju anklagat Israel för att eventuellt ha begått folkmord. Dessa lögner ska avslöjas, som jag brukar säga. Sanningen måste upprepas så att lögnen inte får fäste. Och detta är ju så fruktansvärt därför att Israel har ju bevisligen gjort allt de kan. IDF har gjort allt de kan för att skydda och evakuera civila. Det är mot terroristorganisationer och Iran som man strider. Sitt försvarskrig, ett försvarskrig. Det här är falska anklagelser mot Israel. Och det är som sagt då Hamas som är skyldiga till folkmordsmassakern 7 oktober förra året, och det är även lögnhalsarna som kallar sig pro-palestinier som vill se folkmord på judar. Så är det. Sen kan de bortförklara och förneka hur mycket de vill, men alla som tar del i det ropar faktiskt efter folkmord, och det ska ställas framför dem att det är det handlar om och inget annat. Så ett utdrag av det som Mike Wagenheim skriver i DNS. FN godkänner en stor konferens för en palestinsk stat. En israelisk diplomat anklagade FN för fixering av anti-israeliska resolutioner från världens värsta människorättsförbrytare. Bara timmar innan generalförsamlingen överväldigande antog en resolution som godkände en högnivåkonferens till stöd för tvåstatslösningen. På tisdagen röstade generalförsamlingen med, hör och häpna, 157 mot 8 marginaler med 7 nedlagda röster för att hålla en konferens i juni 2025 som syftar till att anta ett handlingsinriktat resultatdokument för att brådskande kartlägga en oåterkallelig väg mot en fredlig lösning av den israelisk-palestinska konflikten och genomförandet av en palestinsk stat. Här kan man inte låta bli att inflika, eller jag kan inte låta bli att inflika en gång för 100:e gången. Israels land har tillhört det judiska folket sedan urminnes tid, tillbaka till Abrahams tid när det började och Gud uttalade löften om landet. 3000 år tillbaka när David var kung i Israel, och detta land har aldrig varit palestinskt. Det har varit under olika stormakters dominans, ockupation, precis som romarna ockuperade Israel på Nya testamentets tid när Jesus föddes och levde i landet. Romarriket ockuperade landet då, men det var fortfarande Israel, det judiska landet. Så detta är ju helt emot fakta, emot Bibeln, emot allt sunt förnuft som vi vet. Jag fortsätter i artikeln här. Texten från konferensen bifogades en 7-sidig resolution som fördömde israeliskt samhällsbyggande bortom den så kallade gröna linjen och in i östra Jerusalem och Judeen och Samarien. Den avvisar också alla demografiska eller territoriella förändringar i Gazaremsan och uppmanar enträget att en palestinsk stat ska bildas enligt vapenstilleståndslinjerna från 1949. Det här är så sjukt så det finns ju inte ord. En tvåstatslösning förblir det enda hoppet om att bryta den oändliga våldscykeln. Det enda hoppet att se en säker och välmående framtid för båda folken, sa James Larsen, Australiens FN-ambassadör, före omröstningen. Om dessa aktörer, jag hoppar lite i texten här, tar lite utdrag. Om dessa aktörer verkligen var intresserade av att komma med lösningar till den krigshärjade regionen skulle de överge sina tvångsmässiga ansträngningar att delegitimera Israel, sa Ben Naftali, och istället fokusera på att befria gisslan, stoppa Hamas styre i Gaza och stoppa den utbredda terrorgruppens plundring av humanitärt bistånd avsett för palestinier i remsan. Hamas missbrukar FN-medel för att upprätthålla sina terroristaktiviteter, ett faktum som inte nämns i de rapporter och resolutioner som diskuterades denna vecka i dessa salar, sa Ben Naftali, och uppmanade FN att hålla Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran och andra terrororganisationer ansvariga för regionens kaos och förstörelse. Amen, säger vi till det. Så sant. Vi håller med. Den högnivåkonferens som ingår i resolutioner är planerad att hållas i New York tillsammans med Frankrike och Saudiarabien. Frankrikes president Emmanuel Macron talade på tisdagen under ett besök i Saudiarabien och sa att Frankrike kommer att erkänna en palestinsk stat, men bara vid ett användbart ögonblick. Han uttryckte hopp om att toppmötet också skulle innehålla diskussioner om att ta hänsyn till Israels säkerhet. Generalförsamlingen antog på tisdagen resolutioner som kräver Israels tillbakadragande från Golanhöjderna och tillhandahåller resurser till FNs avdelning för palestinska rättigheter som övervakar organiseringen av möten och konferenser som främjar bojkotter, sanktioner och delegitimisering av Israel. Slutcitat. Jag brukar säga att FN står ju för nötternas förbund eller dårarnas förbund väldigt ofta. Och det är klart att om man vill väcka Guds vrede och dra förbannelse över sig så får man göra det. Det är ett eget val. Och det är vad FN gör. Och detta som man då vill, det bygger enbart på lögner. Enda sättet att få slut på våldsspiralen, som man kallar det, är att fördöma och motarbeta terrororganisationerna, kasta ut UNRWA och FN ur Gaza och även Libanon. De gör ingen nytta, tvärtom. Dra igång en sund undervisning i skolorna i Gaza och mata världen med sanningen om landet istället för alla dessa lögner. Ja, det är upprörande. Och man har rätt att bli upprörd på detta sjuka. Nu har vi facit i hand, vi har bibelordet så vi vet hur allting kommer att gå, tack och lov. FN har inte sista ordet, långt ifrån. Gud har sista ordet. Ja, så nästa nyhet här. Från Israel Unwired. Kaos i Syrien. Kaos i Syrien. Och försök förstå Syrien, vad som händer i Syrien, den som kan. Alltså när man läser eller lyssnar på olika förklaringar om detta land så är det ju bara kaos. Det är nästan omöjligt att förstå vad som sker. Och då ska vi påminna oss om att Gud varnar för att förbanna Israel och falskeligen ge sig på att anklaga Israel som Syrien har gjort. Syrien har varit en ärkefiende i många år till Israel. Det är alltså kaos och det är konsekvenserna. Det är vad vi menar det är konsekvenserna av antisionismen. Israel står inför Assads fall och de kommande turkiskt stödda jihadisterna. På senaste dagarnas nyheter är det plötsligt genombrottet för syriska rebeller i Idlib-provinsen och deras förmåga att inte bara erövra Aleppo, som är Syriens näst största stad, utan nu deras marsch in i Hama, tiotals kilometer söderut. Ikväll finns det rapporter om splittring inom den syriska militären i Damaskus och rykten om ett försök till militärkupp som kan se det slutgiltiga slutet för Assad-regimen. Allt detta hotar stabiliteten och livskraften för Syrien som ett land, eftersom de nuvarande nationella gränserna har flera andra aktörer som tävlar om kontroll. Mellan USA stödda SDF i öst, turkiska rebeller i nordväst och den ryska och iranska stödda regeringen som drivs av Assad samt druserna i söder, är Syrien allt annat än ett stabilt land. Slutcitat där, och Amir Sarfati skriver i sitt nyhetsbrev, vad var detta? Ja, förra veckan sprängdes Syrien. Det har alltid varit en krutdurk med så många antagonistiska grupper som bor i nationen. Så även om det inte var en överraskning var det viktigt. Jag är säker på att många är förvirrade över vem som är vem i Syrien och i ännu högre grad hur allt relaterar till Bibelns profetier. Damaskus är en stad som Bibeln förutspår kommer att decimeras. Om vi vidgar oss från själva staden kan vi också se att Syrien, som har varit en bitter fiende till Israel sedan 1948, inte nämns bland nationerna i Gogs framtida krig från Magogs land som beskrivs i Esekiel 38. I slutändan, det vi lär oss om nationen i norr är att Damaskus måste falla. Detta kommer att bidra till att Israel blir starkt, säkert och välmående. Det är då som fienden kommer att anfalla från norr. Slutcitat där. Jag återkommer till den profetian där i Jesaja som han syftar på. Amen. Amir skriver idag på Telegram: Premiärminister Netanyahu sammankallar för närvarande en diskussion om utvecklingen i Syrien med ledarna för säkerhetsetablissemanget efter att staden Hama fallit till rebellerna idag. I Israel var man förvånad över rebellernas snabba framsteg och deras ockupation av staden Hama, eller Hama, hur den uttalas, inom några timmar. Det finns också förvåning över Rysslands relativa brist på engagemang som inte har bombat byar i Syrien i lika stor utsträckning som de gjorde för nästan ett decennium sedan när de räddade Assad-regimen från kollaps. Israel förbereder sig också för möjligheten att Assads regim kan kollapsa på grund av rebellernas snabba framryckning. Dessutom förbereder sig Israel för potentiella iranska försök att etablera en betydligt starkare närvaro i Syrien genom att sätta in iranska styrkor och avancerade vapen. En säkerhetskälla sa till IDF radio: det sista Israel vill är att Syrien ska falla i iranska händer. Vi kommer att fortsätta att agera för att förhindra att detta händer. Som en påminnelse kan nämnas att rapporter från Syrien ikväll, detta var då igår kväll, indikerade en israelisk attack riktat mot avancerade vapen sydost om Aleppo som Israel inte ville skulle falla i rebellernas händer. En annan trend som identifierats av säkerhetsetablissemanget är att Hezbollah flyttar sitt fokus från Libanon till Syrien och förflyttar styrkor dit. Dessutom har Hezbollah förlorat kapacitet och militär utrustning som var avsett för dem som istället föll i rebellernas händer. Slutsatsen från kvällens diskussioner är tydlig. Iran får inte tillåtas stärka sitt fotfäste i Syrien och ta över landet under sken av att stödja Assad-regimen. Assad-styrkorna drar sig tillbaka från landsbygden i västra Deir ez-Zor och överlämnar den till PKK-YPG-gruppen, kurderna alltså, efter en gemensam försvarsöverenskommelse för att blockera rebellernas framryckningar. Slutcitat där. Det var från igår kväll. Alldeles nyss idag skriver Amir på Telegram: Det israeliska försvarsetablissemanget förbereder sig för det nära förestående fallet av den syriske presidenten Bashar al-Assads regim eftersom rebellstyrkor ledda av Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, fortsätter att göra betydande territoriella vinster i norra delen av landet. Med Israel som har utfärdat en varning till Iran mot att de skickar trupper till Syrien. Ett nytt uppror bryter ut mot Assad i Daras-provinsen i södra Syrien alldeles intill gränsen till Jordanien och Israel. Assads soldater avväpnas antingen av folkmassorna eller flyr från sina positioner. Slut citat. Det är kaos med andra ord. Varje gång det händer något i Syrien så går tankarna till oss som läser Bibeln säkert då till bibelordet som står om i Jesaja. Och vi läser det från kapitel 17 och vers 1. Profetia om Damaskus. Det här är en profetia som inte har uppfyllts i historien, menar man. Och därför så kan vi ju misstänka att det ligger framför och kanske i en ganska snar framtid. Se, Damaskus ska upphöra att vara en stad. Det ska bli en ruinhög. Aroers städer blir övergivna. Det blir ett tillhåll för jordar som lägger sig där utan att någon skrämmer dem. Det här är alltså Damaskus förödelse som det står om förutsagt här. Här kommer nu till sist en video med Jair Pinto och Matti Shoshani på TBN som tar upp situationen i Syrien framförallt, och de tar upp en del från Gaza också och läget där nere. Det är ju ett tag sedan som i alla fall jag hade med Jair Pinto eller Matti Shoshani här på Profetisk uppdatering, så det är väl på tiden igen. Så med detta önskar jag er Guds välsignelse och shalom.
Civil war in Syria, or as we say, what goes around comes around, because it's everyone, it's the same players in the same place, just reliving again another struggle that's been taking place.
Yeah, it's like kind of a rebranding of the Islamic State, a rebranding of Al-Qaeda as, you know, freedom fighters for Syria. It's always the same, and everything comes around in the Middle East. And also today, we're going to give you an update from the Gaza Strip with Alon, one of our workers that you met a few programs back. And most importantly, we maybe will be able to find a name for this podcast, because you guys sent us hundreds of suggested names, and we're going to bring a huge ball of names and show it.
We can't promise that we're going to pick one of them.
Yeah.
So a war broke out in Syria in highly suspicious timing. As Israel signs the peace agreement or the ceasefire agreement,
I think one day after.
Yeah, the day after we signed a ceasefire agreement with Lebanon and Hezbollah, with the help of our American friends and several others,
and French,
and the French, all of a sudden, this rebel group within Syria that's been quiet for quiet as far as international media goes for 8 years, attacks the Assad regime soldiers, takes over the second largest city in the country, Aleppo, and starts pushing back the forces of Assad. Images that we haven't seen in almost 10 years, over 8 years in Syria, of convoys of Syrian soldiers fleeing, leaving behind artillery and machines and stuff like that, running out of gas and just leaving their vehicles on the side of the road and fleeing.
No, it's a big mess. This rebel group is called Tahrir al-Sham, and it's an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. Some former members of ISIS are part of it. So to paint the picture, in Syria currently, you have the Assad regime, you have the Russians, you have Turkish forces fighting Kurdish rebels, and you have the
American Special Forces.
Yeah, American Special Forces
on the border with Jordan.
With Jordan, you have Sunni rebel forces, Tahrir al-Sham, and members of former ISIS groups.
You have the Iranians.
Hezbollah was supposed to coming to help, but they are weakened because of the war with Israel. So they officially said that they're not joining in to help Assad. And the latest development was, which was actually pretty shocking, that the Assad regime called on Israel for help against all these rebel groups.
Once again, of course, Israel is to blame.
Yeah, let's get Israel into another conflict. We just signed a ceasefire. We're ready to fight another front.
It's interesting because we were reporting on this earlier this week on Boots on the Ground, talking about the fact that the Iranians are blaming Israel for this attack. And they say that the timing is very suspicious because exactly when a ceasefire agreement is signed, suddenly these rebels come out of the holes. But what really happened is that the rebels saw a moment of weakness.
Yeah.
And again, we've talked about this many times on the podcast. Everything is about a projection of power in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And what people have seen is they've seen Israel gain, I don't want to call it popularity, go up in its ranking of power and projection of power in the Middle East, together with the American allies. And then we've seen at the Hezbollah in Iran go down, I mean, substantially in their effect and their projection of power. And everyone that looks at this says, here's a moment where we can seize an opportunity. And everyone wants to seize an opportunity. Yeah. You have, and again, this is like the microcosm of the Middle East. Every international force and every country has interests that are embedded in what's happening right now in Syria. And it sort of like projects on these different images. You have the Turks who are, I mean, have been fighting for decades against the Kurds. Yes. The Kurds are, I say minority, they're an enormous minority, bigger than the state of Israel in Turkey. Anything that has the word Kurds on it, the Turks are afraid of, so they fight. Yeah. The Jordanians are terrified of destabilization, they fight. The Hezbollah, or I should say the Iranians with Hezbollah, they want Syria open for traffic, they fight.
I think everything connected to what Israel did to Hezbollah, and right now Lebanon is on the map. Lebanon is not controlling herself, and it's looked like that the moment Hezbollah fell, all those organizations gained power to go out and...
I mean, that's what we thought initially, and then they've said, it just, again, the news cycle is limited in what it can cover. If you're talking about Israel and then the Ukraine, you don't have time to talk about small factions in Syria, in northeastern Syria, making threats against the Assad regime that covers or controls other parts.
It's better for everybody to focus on Israel. This is what's
but it comes at their expense. Because they've been warned, like, let's be honest here, the HTS, which I find the acronym to be funny.
HTS is
Chai Tahrir el-Sham.
But can you
they're a rebranded organization. Yeah. And they have this acronym that sounds like they're a tech company from Asia.
HTC?
Yeah, HTC, something.
They didn't pay us for this, so we should maybe not advertise them.
But
you can look them as stocks.
These same people, just a few years ago, were called Jabhat al-Nusra. They were involved in the war, the ISIS war, from the wrong side.
The same people.
Yeah, from the wrong side, not the good side. From the bad side, they were affiliated with Al-Qaeda. They were known to be extremely violent against religious minorities and women. Yeah. And they've done this rebrand, and suddenly they're the freedom fighters of northeastern Syria. It's ridiculous. Let's identify the people for who they are. They are a religious, extreme
terrorist group.
Yeah, violent group.
That's what they are. We shouldn't think that, okay, they are fighting against the Iranian forces in Syria, so Israel should support them. Yeah. No. They hate Israel, they hate the Jewish people, and after they take over Syria or the Iranians, which are Shiite, they will focus their attentions against Israel, like any other terrorist group in this region.
Can you explain to everybody what's going on in Syria right now, and why a moment before this uprising in Syria, why Syria is a hotspot for terrorists anyhow?
Syria, I think that's a great question, Thomas. Syria, and people have trouble understanding this, is still called a country, but it hasn't been a country in a long time.
True.
Many countries fell apart during the Arab Spring or the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and Syria is one of the few that maintained control of the country to a certain degree.
Somewhat. Mainly because of the Russian support for the Assad regime.
Russian foreign involvement, but you look at Libya. Libya is no longer the country that it was. You look at Egypt; they had to change governments twice, and they had essentially a military coup taking over the country. Iraq fell apart. So again, it was a very destabilizing wave that went through the Arab world. Assad maintained, but again, it took multiple years, almost 10 years of fighting, for him to regain or maintain control of the country, and that country remained unstabilized or destabilized dramatically because of that. And again, if you want to go even farther back, everything in the Middle East always goes back to to the post-World War I and then post-World War II effect of the international powers at B, going back to, let's call it to the imperialist season.
Yeah.
And if you think Sykes-Picot, you think the British, the French, looking at maps in a boardroom, they draw a line, the line disregards completely ethnic boundaries.
Anything,
Disregards
no connection to
completely.
reality, families,
They say,
anything.
This looks like...
It's not straight.
Yeah.
Put the line straight on the map.
This looks like a nice shape, and they draw this square on the map, not thinking about the fact...
Cuts a village between into half in Syria, half in Israel.
Yeah, and some guy in the back says, hey, don't forget, we promised this family that they can be leaders, and then you have a country like Syria. A country like Syria where, again, sort of, it's a long chain of events where a tiny religious minority, the Alawites, who are a sect that's not recognized by Islam, or a sect that's considered to be heretic under Islam, they control, they're tiny minority, they're under 10%. Well, depends who you ask, of course. They wouldn't want to admit their numbers. Nice cup,
Yeah, you like it?
Yeah.
My wife made it, by the way.
I was going to say you can't. you can't buy these cups. Thank you to Ana Pinto King for making these glasses. They're very well made.
Very good. Yeah. I don't know how I look.
This bottle you can buy on our merch store.
True.
The TBNIL bottle. It's well insulated and it's survived several drops already and remained intact. Anyway. But you look at that, it's like, that's where it really gets interesting, is you look at, it's this series of decisions where in an inorganic way countries are formed, and then they slowly crumble back to their ethnic and tribal shape and group.
This is, I think, what the West does not understand about the Middle East. Everything is tribes, it's families. I'd say the Gaza Strip, it's not a Palestinian people, it's a combination of a few tribes, a few families that have been fighting each other for many, many years. It's very hard. You have Fatah, which is controlled by this Hamula, and then you have Hamas that is controlled by a different one, and they fight each other. There's no unity or one government. Democracy does not necessarily work in this region.
No, it absolutely doesn't.
Yeah. So trying to implement it.
And I think you make a very important point, which is, we've talked about this before, is when you look at the lifestyle or the survivability of any country that has a substantial, in the Middle East specifically, a substantial Muslim population, specifically when it comes to the Sunni population, the way they survive and the way they stay as a country is with strongman politics.
And like ruling families.
Yeah,
look at Jordan. Jordan, they have the Hashemite kingdom. So it's a family of kings that rule the country.
It's a family of
descendants
let's call it by
Muhammad,
name. Let's call it by name. The whitewashed version of this, they call it strongman politics. Strongman is a PC term for dictator.
Yeah, definitely.
You don't, in these countries, they survived, and think about Jordan, Syria, Lebanon,
Saudi Arabia,
every country in the region, including northern Africa. It was leaders that pulled together many tribes and sects, and they did it like this, with the force of their arm. It's everyone was afraid to uprise because the guy at the top was crazier than them. That's it.
Definitely.
And it survived as long as that guy was in power. And once he's taken out of power, it all crumbles.
Oh, unless the son is also groomed to be
same,
strong,
yeah.
Can you paint in the head of our listener how the map of Syria and where Syria geographically sitting between Iran to Israel, and what in the last years it's, because for me it's looked like.
Can we have
right
graphics?
now
Do we have a budget for graphics on the screen, Tom?
I'm opening the map of Syria here on my Google Maps. Donations. 1 second.
Do we have a budget for that?
Not yet, but hopefully with the donations we can.
Okay, let me show it. I have the map open.
Look,
okay.
we just found this on Google.
We found the map, by the way. Okay, so imagine the Middle East. You have Israel on the southwestern side of Syria with a tiny strip of land touching Syria on the Golan Heights. Then on the western side of Syria you have Lebanon and you have the Mediterranean Sea. In the northern side of Syria you have Turkey, and that's it, like a huge part of Turkey. Eastern side you have Iraq, and southern side you have Jordan. Okay, so it's kind of like...
Wait, it gets more complicated though.
Because Iraq, what?
No,
complicated.
Because in the Middle East, unlike a let's call it a North American or a European viewer that would be watching this, population only lives where there is water. and water is concentrated in very specific places.
Not
So
many water, not much water.
Not much water. So countries are dominated or by river systems, or by access to sweet water, or by access to sea, and a combination of those. Iraq runs, the population of it is centered around the Euphrates. It's the big rivers that hold these countries. Syria is no different than that. Syria runs, like the population is concentrated around the river, but then very specifically in a handful of cities, mostly on the western side of the country. And that's where Assad still maintains power, and this is where it's interesting.
Except for Aleppo, which is also on the western side.
No, now, but that's up till this week.
Yes, exactly.
And they've been fighting there for several years now. His army's been fighting.
2020, it was like frozen, the fight.
It's also important to say.
It is in the last 4 years.
Yeah. And you look at the port city on the western side of Syria called Latakia, which the Russians have a military base there. So there's like many people that are working within this country.
I like how you just said they have. There's an interesting story of how they got that. The Russians.
They took it.
The Russians aided the Assad regime in his civil war. And when they did that, they came to him, as they would say in The Godfather, with an offer he can't refuse. Is our planes are on their way, and in return you're giving us a port. And you're giving it to us forever, and it's never yours again, and it's our No, and they, do you remember the visuals of that? They publicly humiliated Assad. It was intentional. They
paraded in the city.
They paraded him through without his escorts, without his guards. The Russian army paraded him through sort of like their enclave in Syria. Saying, this is our country, and it's very, very clear. The Russians have this super important stake in this part, because they need, and this goes back to Russian geography, they need access to a warm water port. Russia always had a problem where to get to the Mediterranean, they had to go through Turkey, which they never liked. That's always like an issue that they had when, if you're going from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, you have to go through the Turks. They never wanted that. And so their sea was always through the North Sea. And the North Sea is frozen much more. It used to be. Less now with
global warming.
We can't say that.
That's a different
we can't say
podcast.
That. We can't say that. Climate change. Whether or not humans are involved in it is up to debate.
But it's look like okay. So we have Turkey, Iran, and Russia in the story. This is the big countries that playing there.
Turkey, Iran, Russia, the US,
Israel and the US.
And then you have, Jordan, Lebanon, Hezbollah.
I'll say this because this is where it gets really, really fragile in the Middle East. All these big powers have a stake in what's happening. And the reason they have a stake is because if something falls apart or changes dramatically, it affects other countries in a way that is dramatic to them. If Syria falls apart and Assad regime stops to exist, the Turks have an enormous problem with the Kurdish presence in that country. Their whole thing with the Kurds is, we will do, and Saddam Hussein in Iraq was the same previously.
Exactly.
Is we will do everything, period, to prevent these people from having an autonomy. Again, the Kurds, it's a minority of tens of millions who have been ruthlessly killed by every regime in the region.
And they already,
no free Palestine demonstration was for those people.
Thank you for saying that, Tomer. Because it makes me mad. It makes me so mad. Guitar producer was talking about this before
the show.
Yeah, I've been to Kurdistan, and I had this click moment in my head when we were in Kurdistan. We're standing at the northern border over there, and you realize I'm from a minority in this part of the world, that our entire population in the world is what, 15 million people?
15 million
16 million Jews in the entire world. The Kurds are tens of millions, somewhere between, let's say, 20 to 30 million, and they're concentrated in an area. And for generations, the Iraqis and the Turks, I'm just going to say this honestly, have been ruthlessly killing at them to prevent them from having any kind of autonomy.
And nobody cares.
No one talks about it.
I know why, because they don't have a river and a sea.
I think they don't have a sea. They have rivers.
Look, it goes. I mean, Israel is talked about in a disproportionate way because of the spiritual significance, because of where we are in the world, because of many, many different factors. But it just shows you is how rough it is being a minority in this part of the world. It's absolutely terrible. The Kurds still today are fighting against, and this isn't what we're talking about today, but just to understand the balance, the reason Turkey's involved in Syria is because of the Kurds. The reason, and it gets more complicated, the reason the American army has special forces in southern Syria near the Jordanian and the Iraqi border is because they want to prevent the Jordanians from toppling as a government, so they need to protect them from the infiltration of terrorist elements from within Syria and prevent the Iranians from entering into it. The reason we had IRGC officers die in this last conflict this week...
In Syria.
In Syria.
Yes.
In northern Syria, is because the Iranians have a stake in what's happening in Syria. So it's...
Plus, yeah, it's also connected to Lebanon because
it's a land route.
Yeah, you need to ship weapons and trucks to Lebanon, you need to go through Syria. So they need to have some kind of logistical control in that country, especially now that it is collapsed into multiple fractions and nobody really is controlling this area.
Here's a question for you, Yael.
What?
We like to simplify life and always talk about who the good and the bad guys are.
Who the good and the bad guys, yeah.
Who in Syria is the good guy and who is the bad guy?
Very hard to answer. Yeah, I know. People
serious
automatically...
Serious question.
Definitely. People automatically think that that we should support the Al-Qaeda groups because they're anti-Iran. So why shouldn't we support them as Israel?
Yeah.
But they hate us just as much or even more. So what's the point, you know?
Two-faced situation. Cause
they
hate the rebels and Iran together hate Israel. The rebels hate Iran and us.
But they hate each other.
And they hate each other. So, but they have something in common. They can collaborate to fight us.
Yeah, but they hate each other very much now. So anyway,
it's let's be honest here. The Assad regime is one of that's still standing. Is one of the most violent and ruthless regimes that still stands in the Middle East.
Yeah, using chemical weapons against his people.
He used chemical weapons again. He dropped barrels of chemical weaponry on his own population repeatedly. In the aftermath of his fight for power in his country, over a third of his population left their homes. Over half was displaced. You have millions of Syrians that are refugees around the world, hundreds of thousands, if not more, that were killed in this civil war.
Millions in Turkey.
Yeah.
In other places.
So he's not a good guy. He is ruthless, even though he's a dentist.
No, optometrist.
Optometrist?
Whatever you call it. That's what he is. Exactly.
Anyway, even though he's
very qualified to rule a country.
Yeah, he seems like this. He seems like this docile, like kind guy or quiet guy, and he's been violent. He's been ruthless against members of his family, against members of his population, again and again and again. And then you look at HTS. The Syrian tech startup, who are, Jabhat al-Nusra. They're a terrorist organization.
Al-Qaeda, ISIS.
Just a short while ago, the Allied forces were bombing as they were partnering, as they were, again, they're wreaking havoc through the deserts of Syria and Iraq during the good old ISIS days. And so these are the players you're playing with. Then you have the Russians, who are like the archetype of the supervillain from American films.
Behind the scenes, but not behind the scenes.
In the 80s and 90s, and now again, they're always there. And so it's like everywhere you look, there's some kind of villainry involved in the situation. There is no one good. And again, I think you always have to boil this down to the human level. Who is suffering most from this whole thing? The answer is the Syrian people. The people that are suffering most from this. And we can talk about geopolitics and all this stuff. Who's suffering? The civilians.
Always. The poor people, the women, the children.
But this
and those that are not part of any group.
Them, like UNRWA is not helping Syria.
Yeah, there is no UNRWA. UNRWA only cares about the Palestinians. But here's where the news gets interesting. Here's a lesson. I'll say this. I know you know how to do this. A lesson for our viewers on how to read the news. What's the number?
First, ask them to click subscribe.
Yes, please.
Okay. Please subscribe, share, and like us to help us share the truth of what's happening in Israel, in this region, now in Syria, which is very complicated. Thanks so much. Continue.
Anyway, so here's a lesson on how to read the news. Tomer, who's behind a lot of the content that we create, what's the number that they've been quoting for the last week and a half of civilian refugees?
In Syria.
In Syria. Same number.
Around
14,000.
14,000.
For how long has that number existed? A week.
A week.
A week. Same number. Does that make sense?
No,
absolutely no sense.
Definitely not.
So what that shows you is, and I'm saying this, if you're watching this at home, you want to understand how limited the information that hits the news is. This is the example. 14,000 refugees. It's a BS number.
Yeah, nobody cares, basically.
No one cares.
Nobody cares about the Syrian refugees.
On day 2 of the war, a Syrian humanitarian organization reports, and essentially this is the population of a valley. This region left their houses. The population is give or take 14,000.
Yeah.
That's the number we stuck with till now.
It doesn't make any sense.
Stuck with 700 deaths.
Yeah.
And the fights keep
From the
And they took over. Took over the second largest city in Syria, Aleppo.
Yeah.
They took over the palace of Bashar Assad.
But
This number is not making any
we
sense.
saw in the Christian communities there that those rebels took over places. They took kids as
hostages.
slaves. They
Wait, this time around or the previous time around?
previous time. So
No, so okay, this is where it gets really, really interesting. So one, let's establish the facts. No one knows what the numbers are.
Yes.
And everyone like quotes their own numbers, and the same exists in the Ukraine and Russia war, and the same exists, by the way, in Gaza.
Yeah, also.
Where everyone promotes numbers that Israel doesn't do this. But I want to be clear, most countries, specifically non-democracies, they float the numbers that are good for them.
Yeah.
It's always the enemy that dies, and they never touch any civilians. So here we have civilian lives that have been lost. You have the Assad forces pull out of Aleppo, and after they pull out, they start bombing the city with the rebels inside of it. Is that me or you, Yael?
No, it's my wife. Sorry. Gotcha.
Anyway,
Keep going.
You have the Syrian army, quote unquote, Assad's forces pull out of Aleppo, the rebels flow in, and they start bombing the city with the rebels inside of it. They claim, the Syrian army claims, several hundred casualties in that army. So, and then the civilians, of course, are hurt. Civilians are now again displaced once more. It just shows you how tricky this whole thing is in the effect on human life.
I think that it also shows us very clear that this is a spiritual war, and the enemy is focused on events that are happening in Israel and less focused on everything that is happening around the world. And I think that this is very sad for us as believers in Yeshua and in God, that we shouldn't forget about all these prosecution of Christians in Syria, in Iraq, in other places that are not on the news.
Thank you for saying that. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Christianity. Here's where the story gets really, really interesting on a branding perspective.
Yeah.
So our good friends, the tech startup HTS,
what about
formerly
that?
known as Jabhat al-Nusra, that sounds a lot less innocent when you think about it, especially in again, the good old ISIS days. HTS, this time around, they learned a lesson. I'm saying this also for you, Tomer. Mm-hmm. Last time, they kidnapped kids, they took them into slavery, they kidnapped Christian women. We need to do content on this, because you look at like the aftermath of what ISIS and their friends did in the Middle East.
We found Yazidi women in
exactly.
Gaza.
Just now in Gaza.
Just now being released.
In 2024, a young girl who was kidnapped in 2011
by ISIS.
Then
when
sold
she was
to Hamas,
11, that's
11 years
unbelievable.
old. So I want people to understand how terrible life was under these people in the Middle East. No one talks about it.
We all have children. Can you imagine that people coming, taking over you and take your kids and
sell them to be sex slaves? It's insane. And no one talks about this. I don't think there was a single headline.
The Israeli army worked really hard to take this one girl that got into Gaza as a slave, and
released her.
I couldn't leave this story. This story.
That's the ecosystem of the Middle East, or the aftermath of ISIS in one human story. A young girl is released 2 months ago from Gaza. She's been in captivity as a sex slave. She was kidnapped at 13 years ago.
11.
At 11 years old, she was released at 24 years old. She was kidnapped from the Yazidi minority in Iraq, which is they're semi-Christian. They are a sect in Christianity. A Yazidi minority.
Yeah.
She was kidnapped, and again, this is where it's interesting, by a Hamas member who was fighting over there. He brings her back. I think she was sold several times as a slave. Brings her back as one of his essentially wives to the Gaza Strip. Has multiple kids with her. All this time, she is a slave. She is a slave, full stop.
Yeah.
And she's released by the Israeli army.
She writes to a reporter. The reporter gives the army her coordination. The army taking a huge
risk an operation to go and release her.
Release her from this terrorist that is part of Hamas. Now, you will never hear that on universities and campuses over the U.S. talking about they supporting organization that supports stuff like that. And
I have to say these kind of things make my blood boil.
Yeah.
You have all these like the keyboard justice warriors, who are writing, free
Palestine.
Look, like every human life matters. Like there is no there's no distinction between a Jewish life or a Palestinian life or any life. But where on earth have you guys been when this is the reality in the Middle East? Where you have extremist Muslim, terrorist organizations who are selling people into slavery around the Middle East for their religion, and you don't hear anyone talk about it.
And then you focus against the only democracy in this region.
Yeah.
Which is Israel.
But again,
doesn't make any sense.
We're Israelis. It's easy for us to talk about this. I think about those people. Like, just like imagine this happened to your own family, and like a terrorist organization that is evil on a biblical magnitude sweeps through your country and kidnaps everyone. Kidnaps your family, your children, sells them into slavery, and no one around the world wants to talk about that.
Yeah.
That's the situation in northeastern Syria. That's the situation. And no one cares about these things.
And multiply that hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah.
Not just,
millions.
A few. No,
millions.
In terms of kidnapped people and stuff like that.
It's just the toll on human life is incredible. No one seems to care about these kind of things. And it just gets so murky to try to decipher who's the good guys and who are the bad guys. And the bottom line is there are no good guys.
There are no good guys.
No, and let's be honest.
True.
If you look at all these rebel groups.
There are no good guys. If you are a civilian of Syria, if you're a civilian of Iraq, if you're a civilian of Iran, as long as a fundamentalist Muslim regime controls your region, your life is miserable. There is no other way to look at this.
Yeah, that's true.
It's just a varying degree. It's one day it's grape flavored, and another day it's purple flavored. It's always a miserable life existence.
Yeah.
And just it's varying degrees of miserability, or misery. Sorry.
As I said, so guys, if you want to really pray for this region, I would start by praying for the civilians that are affected by these terrorist radical Muslim organizations in Syria now, especially as everything is changing, realities change. People are getting kicked out of their houses. People are being attacked on a daily basis. So they really, really need your prayer in this situation. And it's very complicated. It's very hard to understand who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. So let's also pray for wisdom for our leaders and also for us to understand the situation better and have clarity and have the ability to report to you on really what is happening. So really appreciate it.
I want to add something to what you're saying, Yael. And I think this is where anyone who calls themselves a follower of Christ or a man of God, if you read the Bible, if you read the New Testament, this is what you need to be feeling. You need to look at the images of the civilian suffering of what's happening in Syria now, and you need to let it impact your soul. You have to look at the convoys of people that are fleeing their homes. Look at the convoys of people that are fleeing their homes. Look at the suffering that's inflicted. We were just talking about this last week. I was in Gaza short time ago. And you see the convoys of trucks. A week ago. The convoys of trucks that have to deliver aid. It looks like scenes out of Mad Max. And it is, again, it's the fruit of these organizations, of radical Islam, of the violence that they inflict on the people, that pulls them back into this horrific existence. And I think you have to connect emotionally with what's happening there. This can't be a conversation only about numbers or geopolitics or demographics. It has to be, look at the images and let it sink in.
Yeah, it should be also a spiritual conversation, but you should feel the situation.
Feel compelled.
You should be open
and it connects. You always call people to pray. And I say this is like you can say what you want about it feels sometimes very hard to pray for something that you don't know in person, that you haven't connected with physically and stuff like that. But what prayer does, or meditating on a topic does, is it allows you to emotionally connect to it. And I do this as emotionally when we celebrate when we marked the year for the October 7th events, when we do we have the National Memorial Day here. I try to connect emotionally with the memory of friends and family that I've lost.
Something that is more close to you.
Feel it.
Yes,
I really feel it.
Yeah.
And I think you need to do the same thing here. And again, I know I'm delaying us on talking about all the facts. It's this is about the lives of people.
Yeah.
These are true people that have lived under a terrible dictatorial regime. And then it was replaced by waves of terrorist organizations that kidnap, kill, maim, and destroy everything in the area. again and again and again. And now it's happening again to them.
Yeah.
And the world turns a blind eye and talks about like these names. You know, it's the Liberation Army of Northern Syria
exactly.
and the HTS
the freedom,
and the Assad regime.
Free
and
Syrian Army.
It's like, guys, where is your human compassion? There are people on the ground who are dying because of this. And their life is miserable, and no one is doing anything to really change that situation.
Yeah.
And it should hurt you. You should look at that and say that people are suffering here, and it should bother you.
Yeah,
and it should continue to bother you as long as it exists.
Yeah, but also out of all this hardship, we can also find hope, because we know that when you're suffering, when you are with your backs to the wall, in that location, you are seeking God and asking for something bigger than yourself to come and help you. So I would encourage all of you to really pray that God will reveal himself to all these suffering people in Syria, especially now, and pray for a huge revival in the Middle East. And I believe it's possible. We are serving an awesome God, and he can do it.
Yeah.
And we just received a daily diary from Alon, who works with us. He's now
a friend and a team member.
Yeah, for many years.
Alon, by the way, I did the math. I think he's the longest, aside from myself, he's the longest, definitely on payroll, longest standing member of our team.
Oh, wow.
At this point. Aside
10
from
years
myself.
more?
Yeah.
I'm going on 11 years, and I think Alon is probably 10 years.
8 or
No,
10.
no, 9 or 10 years.
I think it's 10 years.
10 years, yeah. Alon, we met him here the other day. What? And then...
Last night read his diary, and I think the thought that he put up there is something...
I'm going to read it.
Every soldier have in his mind.
Can I also say, I want to say something about people like Alon. This is where I think it's important to understand the humanity of who the IDF is. People imagine, they see the images, it's all like always a wide shot. Wide shot doesn't tell the story. It tells an expose.
It doesn't show the face.
It tells an expose to the story. It's an establishing shot, like we like to say. It's a wide shot. You see the soldiers in their kit, they're driving their vehicles, they're doing their things. And then you zoom in and it's someone like Alon. Alon is a father of children. He has a wife who's alone with the kids at home. His children are young; they miss their father.
Yeah.
Alon is, as far as I know, and I hope he doesn't hear this because I don't want it to get to his head. He's one of the kindest and sweetest and most
humane guys,
humane people I've ever met in my life. He's in Gaza fighting for our country, and there are many like him. And I think that's where it's important to understand.
This is a guy that will stop everything and help you with whatever you do on your way. If you see a group of movers carrying a refrigerator in the street and he's rushing to go home, he'll stop
and
help them carry the refrigerator up and then be late for his whatever stuff that he needs to do. This is the guy, and now he's fighting in the Gaza Strip and defending our country.
And that's how you can pray through this.
Yeah.
Through someone like Alon. That's why we're making this personal. He's a member of our team. I've known him since we were teenagers.
Yeah.
Him and his family since we were teenagers. He's kind. He has a family. He's very much not an aggressive individual.
Yeah, definitely.
He's the exact opposite. He's a compassionate and kind person who's in Gaza now because he feels responsibility for his comrades.
Yes, exactly.
That's why he's back for, what is it, the third or fourth time?
I think it's the fourth time.
Fourth time in Gaza.
Fourth time around. So he has a job with us here in Jerusalem, and he's part of the IDF, so he's been in and out of the army and the office for the past 425 days.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay.